I'm Brandon Huffman. I'm an attorney. I'm also the founder of Odin Media. We are a law firm that focuses in helping digital and creative businesses get formed and get operating and get profitable. So I'm here to talk about starting an arts-related business. It's a pretty broad topic. I'm going to try to give a very big overarching overview for the first sort of 10 steps to starting that process. So the first step is really to decide why you want to start a business. So the legal reason to start a business, to form an entity to operate your business under, is really to separate your assets from the business's assets so that you can have that layer of protection so that if the business faces some sort of claim, they can't come after your personal assets like your house or your checking account that you buy your groceries from. But on a personal level, in order to determine how best to form the business, you should really think about why you're forming it. So for example, if you're forming a business just as a hobby, you're probably going to have some different startup factors than you would if you're forming it and you're planning on taking on outside investors and growing it and selling it to Microsoft or something along those lines. So that leads us to point number 2, which is to choose the form of entity you want to use. So there are a couple of different options here. The first is to have no form at all. What that would be is a sole proprietorship or a partnership with you and a friend. That does not give you the liability protection that I previously mentioned. So as the cautious lawyer, we typically don't recommend doing that. You can even go so far as to file a DBA, which is a doing business as registration in your county, and that would give people notice that this entity name or this name that you're using is you personally. That does not create that separate division between you and the business. So there are a couple ways you can do that. The first is to form a corporation. A corporation would be, you've seen them all over the place. It's My Business Inc. or My Business Incorporated or the My Business Corporation. So in order to do that, we'll talk about the steps there, but the primary factor there that comes into play is that it does create that division that we talked about, and then it also enables you to take in outside investment or to have a real corporate formal structure around your business going forward. The downside to having a corporation is that you do get taxed at the corporate level, the business level, and then also when you distribute that money to yourself individually. There is another way to form the business called a limited liability company or an LLC. That also gives you that liability shield and that separation, but it does have some limitations on what you can do on the corporate side. So for example, it's a little bit more difficult to accept in outside investment because of the tax consequences for the investor. If you're not looking at doing that in the near future, you can save money on your personal taxes by forming as an LLC. For the tax consideration, there is a third option, which is an S-Corp, which is either an LLC or a corporation that files a tax election to be taxed as though it's a partnership or an LLC with a pass-through taxation. That is something that I'm not really going to get too far into on this video. That's something that you should talk to about with your accountant. After you've decided on a form, step 3 is to formally register that with the Secretary of State. So if you're forming an LLC, you'll file a set of articles of formation with the Secretary of State. If you're forming a corporation, you'll file articles of incorporation. Those are for single member organizations, both relatively straightforward processes. If you're going to be forming with more than one person, you should probably talk to an attorney or at least a business advisor of some kind about considerations for those documents. Step 4, after you've registered with the Secretary of State, is to get an EIN or an employer identification number from the IRS. And you might be saying, but I don't have any employees. Or you might be saying, I thought that as an LLC I was going to not have double taxation. Well, the reason you need a EIN is, first of all, you need it to open a bank account. No bank in the country is going to give you an account without an EIN. You also need it, if you ever do have employees, you'll need it to file their taxes, your portion of their taxes. You'll likely also need it to work with your accountant to prepare your year-end taxes or to do that on your own. Step 5 is to consider whether you need any other business licenses. So North Carolina has a list of about 700 different types of businesses that are regulated industries. So for example, as an attorney, I am in a regulated industry. That one is probably a little more apparent and clear than some of the others. So for example, if you are a boxing promoter in North Carolina, you have to get a license to do that. Something more arts related, if you're a landscape architect, there's a license for that. So for any of those, you would need to get the appropriate licensing from the licensing agency, which is going to be separate from the Secretary of State, with a few exceptions which are actually run through the Secretary of State, like lobbyists. There is a good resource at the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina that has a list of those and information on what those different regulations look like. The next step, step 6, is to go to the Department of Revenue, the North Carolina Department of Revenue, and figure out if and how you have to pay taxes to the state. So if you are an LLC, like I mentioned, you may not have to pay corporate taxes. You may still have to pay sales or use taxes, or you may have to pay privilege taxes in certain industries, and you'll have to pay them for employee withholdings when you hire your first employee. Step 7 is to open a bank account. And I mentioned this before when I talked about the EIN. The importance of opening a bank account can't really be overstated. If you're forming this entity and the purpose is to separate your assets from the businesses, you have to observe all of the formalities that come along with that. So you have to open a bank account to make sure that your money and the business's money are separate, and if one of you does get claim against you or something along those lines, you can point to which money is which. So after you form the bank account, it's very important not to use that business money for your personal expenses or vice versa. Step 8 is to consider professional services. So what I mean by that is consider along the way on each of these steps whether you should be hiring an attorney to help you, hiring an accountant to help you, or consider whether you need insurance. So for example, if you're going to lease a space and you're going to have a physical presence, I would definitely recommend that you have at minimum a general liability policy. If somebody trips and falls in your art gallery or in your movie theater or whatever you happen to be operating, you want to make sure that the insurance company bears that responsibility instead of your new business. So step 9 is a nebulous one. Basically, step 9 is a list of question marks that leads to your profit. So step 9 is do whatever your arts business is, make as much money as you can, and keep at it so that you can stay in business. And that's up to you to figure out, not up to me. But step 10 is after you've done that for about a year, you will have to file an annual report with the Secretary of State that says, hey, we're still a business, this is the name of it, and these are our current officers, etc. And you'll have to pay taxes at the end of every calendar year. So that's step 10. A couple of other things you may want to consider are intellectual property protection throughout the process. So for example, whether or not it's worthwhile to register a trademark for your company's name or any of its products, or if you have any processes that are patentable, that kind of question. Along the trademark lines, before you form, you should probably do a quick name search to make sure that the name you want is available and isn't owned by a major corporation that is going to come down on you for using it. For additional resources, you can check out the Triangle Artworks website, or you can look at the North Carolina government's website at nc.gov, and you can click on services and then business, and there's a whole list of resources there.